Welcome to the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Our mission is to help executives thrive as cyber risk managers. Your hosts are Kip Boyle, Virtual Chief Information Security Officer at Cyber Risk Opportunities, and Jake Bernstein, Partner at the law firm of K&L Gates. Visit them at cr-map.com and klgates.com.
So, Kip, what are we going to talk about today in episode 105 of the Cyber Risk Management Podcast?
I just love how you kick it off. This is episode 105, which I'm still is causing my head to spin a little bit at how cool that is. But let's get to it. Today, we're going to explore something that maybe most of our listeners already understand, but I don't know that they all do, which is your IT person, your guy or your gal that's providing IT services to your company isn't your cybersecurity person.
Yeah, isn't that kind of obvious? Maybe it is to us.
I thought it was obvious, but recently I've learned that it's not. It's not obvious to everybody. It's certainly not obvious to every senior decision maker that I've been encountering. So I thought we should probably just make this a very explicit conversation.
Well, I think it's worthwhile, and for a number of reasons. One is I love it when I have a link to an episode that I can just send to someone to explain something rather than repeat myself.
Right.
And hey, listeners, if you already know this, that's what you can do with this episode: is send a link to someone who doesn't already understand, and hopefully we can try to make that clear. So anyway, Kip, how did you learn this time? Because this seems like it's something kind of recent.
Well, yeah. So it's an inflection point, right? I mean, this is something that I've known for a long time. But so what's happening with me, and again, I'm a practitioner. I'm a virtual chief information security officer who also teaches, right? And my podcast is part of how I teach, right? So I practice and I teach. And recently I've been helping a lot of companies either apply for or submit an application to renew their cyber insurance policy.
In one case, that's exciting these days. It's much harder than it was a year ago.
Oh man, and yeah, definitely. There's so many changes. The need to have help from somebody like me has really intensified because the market has hardened. That's a little twist of phrase that I've been learning lately, which means it's getting harder and harder to get approved for cyber insurance. And if you are approved, the amount that you're going to pay is going to go up, and in some cases substantially. The amount of coverage that you get is going to go down, and the amount of deductible that you're going to have to pay is going to go up. So, and then as sort of part of that, what we're also seeing is that insurance carriers are being completely ruthless about who's in, who can get insurance, and who's out. And I've definitely seen cases where the quote to get a policy was so absurd. I mean, it just wasn't economical. To get $1 million of coverage costs, and I'm just throwing out some figures here to illustrate the point. But to get $1 million of coverage, you'll spend $200,000 of premium, and this is just for a year, and you'll have a $250,000 of retention, which is the fancy word for deductible. And so it's just like chief financial officers are looking at that and going, "This doesn't make any sense."
I mean, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but of course that's what we do here on the Cyber Risk Management Podcast.
Which is why we have a script.
Which is why we have a script. And maybe this is just a teaser for another episode, but that is starting to, I mean, even last year we would say without any hesitation that cybersecurity liability insurance is a no-brainer, automatic, like almost minimum viable, component of risk management. But what you just said starts to throw that into at least a little bit of doubt.
Yeah, I think so. I think we were even getting to the point where we were saying that it's unreasonable not to have.
We totally
not to have
that.
It, right?
Yeah.
Per se unreasonable. And so, but now the economics of it are shifting because, insurance companies have had their rear ends handed to them on a silver platter in the last couple of years. They're losing money left and right. A product that used to be highly profitable with large profit margins has suddenly turned sour, and they've got to figure out how to deal with this. Some carriers are exiting the market because they're like, hey, this is too much for us. We don't have the stomach for this. And the ones that are staying are really rolling up their sleeves and getting super, super serious about this. And so, we had a $1 billion company ring us up the other day. It was a referral from a insurance broker, and they got one of these outrageous quotes for renewal. They'd had cyber insurance for 10 years, and the CFO said, this is ridiculous. We're going to self-insure for cyber. Go find somebody that'll help us do that. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating when
It is
I started
fascinating.
talking to them. And I thought to myself, well, I've never heard anybody call it self-insuring for cyber before. But then as I reflected on it, I thought, well, you know what? Really, anybody who doesn't have cyber insurance going back
Is
10, 20
self-insuring.
years
Yeah.
is self-insuring by definition, but I've just never looked. That's like looking at it through the wrong end of the telescope, right?
Yeah.
So
It is. And this is really fascinating too. I mean, I think we've mentioned it in, I'm sure, a relatively recent episode or two, but I remember, Kip, not that long ago, 2017-ish, maybe
mhm.
maybe it was 2018, where you and I were doing a presentation with one of our broker friends. And, we had kind of planned to ask this question, and it didn't go so well for us at the time. We said, so, broker friend, name being, protected to protect the, or yes, withheld to protect the innocent.
Mhm.
Um, you know, well, what kind of questions is the insurance company going to ask you when you're trying to get in cyber insurance? And he said, well, really, really not that many. They're not going to look too much at you back in
Right.
2018.
Yeah.
And let's just say that things have
It was a
changed.
single page of questions. Most of the questions, were kind of, silly. And it seemed like, almost anything you put down there, you'd be approved. I mean, unless egregiously, said something that was just so awful.
We have no firewalls. In fact, we let people come in and do whatever they like on our network. And that
Oh,
that
because
might have gotten you
because we're a
less insured.
university.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Brutal.
So, but yeah, it was just super, super easy. Okay, with that context, I will now answer the question that you just raised, which is, why is it so front of mind for me right now that your IT person isn't your cybersecurity person? Well, again, I've been helping with these insurance applications, and what I've noticed is that most of the people that are filling out the applications work in IT, but they're not dedicated to IT security. And some of them, in fact, are the owners or the senior technology people at an outsourced IT company that's actually filling out these applications. And I was kind of
Oh
stunned by
man,
that.
that's a little distressing. Um, so okay, there's a couple of issues there. The thing about so let me ask you this: in the situations where you're seeing the outsourced IT company filling out these applications, are they Are they the like, what kind of networks do these companies have? I mean, do they have any, or is it like, are they quote modern cloud first? Cloud first
Mm-mm.
being my new
No,
preferred
no.
cl
So these tend to be more well-established companies with what I would call legacy networks, local area networks, extensive local area networks, hardware on-premise in racks. Maybe they have a data center or they rent colo facilities, or maybe the outsourced IT provider actually has their hardware in racks in their controlled data space. So these are older, these are companies that have older architectures. They are not cloud first companies. They do use a lot of software as a service, but they have a lot of legacy IT, and that's why they need outsourced IT service providers, because they've got a lot to manage. Because what I've noticed is that our cloud first customers don't tend to have a managed service provider, because
True. That's
they
true.
they just
Good
don't
point.
need that much help.
Fascinating. Okay, so I guess the other component is why does it matter if it's if it's IT, if it's not, if these IT folks aren't also the dedicated IT security? Like, what is that going to do on the insurance applications?
Yeah, I'm seeing all kinds of things. Let me just give you a couple of examples. So, first of all, the questions, they don't understand all the questions. And so the answers that they're putting down are the result of of an incorrect interpretation of the question, right? So, just to give you a silly example, the question might be, and by the way, the insurance carriers are their own worst enemy when it comes to this sort of thing. But the question might be, do you use multi-factor authentication? Question mark, blank line. That's it. That's all it asks. Well, you and I both know that you need to enable multi-factor authentication on a platform by platform basis. There's no one single switch that you can go to flick to enable MFA everywhere that an organization has sensitive data. It doesn't
That
matter
that that
what
would
your
be
IT
nice.
architecture is. And so IT people look at that and they have a couple of reactions. One reaction is that they know it's a silly question because there's no easy answer, and they get kind of frozen. They get a little analysis paralysis because that little teeny weeny line that's about 4 inches long on the application is not enough space to describe just how complicated the answer really is. And so that's one problem is they get stuck because the answers can't be as simple as the questions.
Yeah, that's very true.
And then
So
you get other things like, do you have DLP? Well, most IT people don't even know what DLP is, and I don't even know if anybody listening to this podcast even knows what DLP is. It's
data
data
loss
loss
prevention.
prevention. And most people think that data loss prevention is a category of product that you have to purchase, blinky lights and racket and that sort of thing. And that's one way to do it, right? But data loss prevention is a lot of things. It doesn't have to be a single product that you buy from a single vendor. It can be all kinds of things, but that's a nuance that most IT people, first of all, don't understand what the acronym is, but then beyond that, they don't understand that there's nuance. So, and I feel
Yeah.
bad for them
Oh
because
yeah, for sure.
nobody's really set them up for success.
Okay, so you know, there's this live session that you did called Cybersecurity for Insurance Professionals. Um,
I just did it
and
last
you did
week.
last week even. Okay. Um, and tell me about how you started off that session. And let's talk about that.
So first of all, the way I prepped for that session, and this is what I try to do with all the sessions that I facilitate, is I was talking to the conference organizer and I said, well, for the people who are planning to attend, what is it that they're struggling with? What do they want to know? And so the conference organizer did a wonderful job of prepping me, and as I was listening to the response, I realized, oh my gosh, these are insurance brokers, these are representatives from insurance carriers, and I thought, well, they're all struggling with this problem, because they're having such a hard time. So if you're a broker, you've got to sell policies, you've got to place insureds with insurance carriers, you have to bind insurance policies, and then you get a commission. That's how brokers make money. But they're having a really hard time right now because the questionnaires are getting longer and longer and longer from the insurance carriers. A lot of the questions are obtuse or oversimplified, and then they're trying to get these applications filled out, but they're having a really hard time getting them filled out because the people responding to them, see the previous 5 minutes of conversation you and I just had for why they're struggling.
Hmm.
And so it just became obvious to me that that there's this mismatch. They're assuming that the IT people are the cybersecurity people and that they can answer all these questions. So there are about 100 people in the audience when I opened up my session, and I just said, hi, it's great for me. It's great to be here. Hope you're doing well. I want to ask you a question to get everything started. And I said, raise your hand if you know that your IT guy or IT gal isn't your cybersecurity person. And about 40% of the people in the room raised their hand as saying, yeah, I know that. But 60% of the people didn't raise their hand, and most of them had a very
Oh,
confused look on their face.
well, that is okay. So now it's very, very clear why we're talking about this. And so just to be clear, your IT guy or gal isn't your cybersecurity person. Now, Kip, that might sound that even though we know that, that can still sound odd. So why is it that the two functions actually don't have that much overlap?
Well, it's funny because if you're a senior decision maker let's say you're a CFO and you came up through the ranks in the finance department. You're a chief operating officer and you came up, that way, or you're chief marketing officer, chief revenue officer, whatever, right? And you've never come up through systems, right? Through the IT department. You've never really had any substantive interaction with them. You sort of think that all IT people know everything in equal measure,
Don't
right?
they?
Because you just don't understand, the nuances, and why should you, right? You just haven't had that
Yeah.
experience. So here I am to tell you that there's a lot of nuance. Just like a person who's really great at networking generally doesn't know anything about databases. You're going to take a networking problem to a network person and a database problem to a database person, and it's the same thing with cybersecurity. B- You know, Cybersecurity people know a lot about what network people know and database people know. They have a lot of similar skills, and conceptually, they understand how systems work and how tech works and that sort of thing. But what differentiates them is that they have very different goals and they have very different ways of thinking, which is, once we unpack this, I think people will go, "Oh, that's why the cybersecurity people are so weird."
Hey, man. Okay, I guess we are guilty as charged there. So, I mean, you're right. The goal of IT is to keep systems running for customers and staff, whatever it takes. In other
Yeah,
words, keep the
because that's
lights
what they get beat
on.
up over.
Yeah, exactly. Available, and to bring this into the CIA triad, and I know that there are other ways of thinking about it, but IT is really focused on availability first,
Hmm.
and confidentiality and integrity are, frankly, it's probably integrity as a second place, and then as a distant third would be confidentiality. That
I would
just
almost
isn't
say
their
they don't have
focus.
a triad, they have a monopod.
It's I think that is true of a lot of IT departments. In fact, I guess, if they even recognize the triad, then they are more of a hybrid department than we're talking about. But I think most aren't. So
Or they work in the defense sector.
yes. But okay, so the default security posture is tilted towards openness because that's the easiest way to avoid support calls, right?
Right.
Keep systems up and running and reduce support calls. That's and the thing is like this isn't laziness. Like they're metrics. Like, the IT departments are often measured on, you know, number of support calls,
Oh, yeah.
mean time to recovery,
Yep.
getting things back up. Like,
Mhm.
this is not an accident.
No, it's not. I mean, think about how many times you've heard somebody say, and for those of you in the audience that have never heard this, here you go. Five nines of availability, right? 99.999% uptime. Or six nines or whatever. I mean, there is this fascination with how available can systems be, and vendors of IT services will talk about, their high availability and how many nines of availability and so forth. So it's almost a fetish in a way at how focused we are on uptime, but it makes sense. Uptime is important, and I can tell you that security does sometimes bork things up. We just migrated to a new web server, and we had some technicians build it out. And then I said, "Well, what have you done?" I said, "Tell me about the security of this thing." And they kind of went, "Oh, right, security." So then they went and did a whole bunch of security work, which was kind of like, it annoyed me because I'm like, "Duh, you don't bolt on security later on. That's not the way to do it." But so here's what happened: is they went off and they did a whole bunch of vulnerability scans and so forth, and ran a whole bunch of checklists, and they put this, the security layers on after they had the thing running. And guess what? They broke a piece of core functionality, and we couldn't send emails for several days because when they
Oh,
when they
man.
applied the security blanket, they actually broke a core piece. It was a Linux server, and they actually broke the cron function. So these little, behind the scenes pieces of code called daemons weren't running and weren't sending the email and receiving the email, and they had to do an extensive troubleshooting session in order to figure that out. And how do you avoid that? Well, you avoid that by baking security in from the beginning, rather than trying to wrap a security blanket on it after it's running. But I can understand why IT people often see security controls as interfering with their work. And so they want to keep everything open and default. And that's because if I'd never asked them, "Hey, what have you done for security?" they wouldn't have done anything more than they had done, which wasn't much. and they never would have broken the emailer, and we never would have had a service interruption because of that. In fact, I was the one that opened up the ticket that said, "How come the emails aren't sending?" And then that's how they figured out the security blanket that they put on messed it up. So, yeah, so IT people want it to be open, and they don't necessarily realize it, but they're taking on a lot of technical risk when they do that. And the data is clear that a lot of the vulnerabilities that are at the root of a lot of the digital crimes that we're seeing is a direct result of this openness.
Well, in contrast, cybersecurity people want to keep systems from being violated, and we
Yep.
want to keep digital assets from being destroyed or stolen, which, really indicates the opposite of openness. We want to be locked down and closed.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, right? We're thinking like, let's not have ransomware on our network. It's super expensive when that happens. It's super disruptive to the business. And it's funny because it actually cuts against the availability objective that IT people have, but there's still a disconnect. They still think that the chance of getting ransomware is like super remote or will never happen. But I can tell you, I've spent a lot of time cleaning up after ransomware. So it absolutely happens, and
Yeah,
it
we both
completely
have.
destroys, yeah, completely destroys the uptime metrics.
Yeah, so I
So
guess so that that mini discussion right there really does indicate to me that when you dig deeper, IT and security really are on the same page. They should be on the same. They could be on the same
yeah, well, that's
page.
why we have a triad, and they
Yes,
have a monopod. But it turns out availability is a concern that we both have.
it is.
But we're also trying to balance integrity and confidentiality as well. So yeah, and then we end up getting twitchy, and we want to say no a lot because just looking around, we see all this risk because of all this openness. And
Yeah.
so when somebody comes to us and says, "Well, we want to do something else," I'm already getting twitchy because I know how open everything is already, and I'm feeling like our digital assets are probably overly at risk already. And go to a twitchy person and ask them to take more risk and see what kind of response you get.
Well, and let's be honest, at least currently, there aren't that many consequences. There aren't a lot of external I don't want to say that. That's not quite true. There are a lot more regulatory consequences for losing confidentiality and mostly confidentiality over availability.
Yeah.
Although it does depend on the situation. So I don't want to. I
Yeah,
don't want to be
I would say,
overly. I want to be
yeah.
careful there.
Well, I would say there's a lot of contractual consequences, right? A lot of, like, you can't fulfill orders you've taken if you have no systems to enable you to
Precisely.
fulfill orders, right? So that's not a regulatory consequence, but really just a contractual one where your customers will walk away from you
Yeah.
because you can't deliver. And I want to share a story about what happened, an incident with a manufacturer, because I think this is illustrative of just how awful this can go, right? You want to talk about availability. So it was in January that somebody passed to me a bankruptcy declaration that had been recently filed, and I want to read some quotes out of that. So, are you ready?
Let's do it.
All right, here we go. So, a ransomware attack recently caused a Texas-based steel structure manufacturer to file for bankruptcy. So, a steel structure manufacturer, think of like, those steel buildings that you see, that are used as sort of like shop to repair cars or whatever, right? That's what we're talking about here. Now, the company's name is United Structures of America, right? USA, or it was. And they got a piece of ransomware on their systems, and they paid it, but guess what? They didn't get their data back. And so in the Chapter 11 bankruptcy declaration, here's what it said. And by the way, this was filed on January 11th, 2022. So this is very recent. Quote, on or about May 25th, 2019, hackers remotely installed ransomware on the company's computer network and destroyed all the information on its servers, more than 400 computers, as well as its computerized numerical control equipment and machinery, CNC. Many of these devices were not only wiped out, but rendered unusable by the malware. So a CNC is like if you have like a piece of raw material, like a piece of steel or something, and you want to change that into like a part, like a screw or whatever, or you want it to be bent into a certain shape so that you can build a building with it, right? These computerized numeric control equipment CNCs will do that so that a person doesn't have to do it, but a computer will do it, and it'll bend it and mill it and make it, precise. It's a very important piece of machinery. These days, you really can't build things without these CNC pieces of equipment. Okay, so I'm almost done. So then it says the company alerted authorities and ultimately paid the attackers the requested ransom, but its data was not returned. The ransomware attack cost the company significant sums of money, and it lost its data relating to accounts receivable, accounts payable, current orders, customer information, current CNC machinery configuration files, along with essentially all of its business data. After the ransomware attack, the company has been methodically winding down its operations. And listen to this, at the height of the company's business, it had over 450 employees and annual revenues of over $100 million.
Gosh, that's tragic. And it's I wonder how often this happens. And I'm guessing this is not an isolated story.
Mm-mm.
I would be shocked. I mean, we know it's not an isolated story,
It's an
and
extreme story,
it is
but
an
they're not the
extreme
only
story,
one.
but they're not the only one. And I think here's my guess, honestly, is that this kind of thing happens a lot more often. Look at the dates, right? This happened originally on or about May 25th,
Mm-hmm.
2019. The Chapter 11 bankruptcy declaration wasn't filed until January 11th, 2022. You're
Yeah.
talking, what is that, 2.5 years later? And what's interesting to me about that is that a lot of this stuff, well, I mean, and maybe there's a news release about a breach, and for a week or less, it's the talk of the security town, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I don't think we're very good at is following that story to the conclusion.
Right.
And this is a really good example. Like, you hear about a ransomware attack. I mean, they happen all the time, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
just constantly.
Legion.
And to give you some idea of the numbers, one of our newish associates used to work at basically an insurance defense firm that
Mm.
basically specialized in incident response. And at the height, a couple of years ago, she was opening, 6 to 10 ransomware matters per day.
Wow.
Right. And that's just her. That's just one associate at one of these firms. And, all of them aren't going to be this bad, right? This one, as you said, is an extreme situation. But,
Right.
and one
But
thing
it's
that
illustrative, right?
it is very
of
illustrative.
of how
And
you don't want ransomware on your network.
oh, you really don't. And I think what's particularly interesting to me about this one is those that's the CNC machines. I didn't
Mhm.
even think about that as a risk, but there is a lot of industrial machinery out there that recovering it, if it's wiped, is probably extraordinarily difficult to impossible. And that is that kind of stuff isn't going to be, that's not going to be backed up on the cloud by default. No, you're going to have had a very intentional disaster recovery, business continuity plan in place with,
Yeah.
careful backup strategies. But this is really just sad.
It's very sad. 450 employees, that's 450 families who had somebody who lost their job.
Well, it's really a lot more than that, right? Because in a company like this, the 400, think of the economic follow-on effects of all of those. Of this,
Oh, yeah.
this is a manufacturer, right? This is like
Yep.
the base of an economy,
Mhm.
and that means that all the service industry folks. I mean, hopefully a lot of these people,
Restaurants.
were able to go get new jobs, but it's still it's a hit for sure.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and
and
how many of them were close to retirement and can't get another job?
that's true. Yeah. In any event, so I guess why do we think this happened, or maybe a better question is, how do you think this relates to what we're talking about today about the IT people?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. So, first of all, I want to harken back to episode 104, right, where we talked about identity crisis, and how the fact that companies who are so dependent on computers to 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 do the work of their company, but don't take it seriously enough, right? That was the whole episode that we did in 104 was about that. And I would say that's one of the things that is absolutely in play with this ransomware attack against United Structures of America is they were 100% dependent on their computers, and when they lost control of them, their company failed. So I think that's something in play. But as far as what is it about your IT person is not your cybersecurity person? Well, I don't. I'd be shocked if United Structures of America, even at $100 million of annual revenue, had even one person whose full-time job was to focus on cybersecurity. I just don't see that, especially in the manufacturing space.
It's probably
Um,
true.
and so, I don't have any. I don't know how to find out for sure, but I'm pretty sure they don't because I've talked with a lot of manufacturers over the years, big ones, and they tend to see IT as a cost center, something that needs to be tightly controlled and minimized as much as possible. So I think it's a reasonable assumption that that they made that same mistake here. So that's what I think. What do you think?
I mean, I think that's probably correct, and I think too that you know until until something like this happens to a non-security business executive, I don't think enough people understand the what it feels like, right?
Hmm.
And because let's be honest about something, right? If we could magically share the emotional experience of a ransomware attack with an executive, that person, I promise you, would sign off on nearly any expense to
Yeah,
prevent them from having to go
yeah,
through that
it's
experience,
awful.
right? It's
Even if you
awful.
don't go bankrupt.
It's awful no matter what, right?
Yeah, it is.
And and it's I mean, it's I've got it. I'm dealing with one right now, and one of the people involved was like, I haven't slept the last 3 days, and it's awful, right? And so, but we can't do that, and we
No.
certainly try to get people to understand. Um, but I think what happens is that, and this really goes to the way that we measure cybersecurity, right? We have a 0 to 10 scale when we do our assessments,
Hmm.
and I think what's challenging is that it's not your typical 0 to 10 scale, right? Where it's just this
Where 10
linear,
is great.
where
Yeah.
10 is great. 10 is actually bad, right?
Hmm.
The 5 to 8 is good, 8 being the best. 9 and 10 though, um, and the reason we do, I mean, there's I'm sure a number of reasons we do it this way, but um, we do it this way because visually it makes a lot of sense to think about how you can get ideal security when it's and ideal security is kind of invisible, right? Like it's
Yeah.
doing its thing, but it's
Yep.
not in your face. The
Right.
second it starts to get in your face, that either means it's not yet, it's not optimized at all, or things have gone too far.
Right.
And we all know what this looks like, right? A 9
Yep.
is when, you're just like, oh, these security guys, it's so annoying. I can't, why are we doing this? And then
Yeah.
10 is like,
I
you're
can't
so
access
frustrated
the
that you go
website.
off and engage in shadow IT
Right.
behaviors.
Right.
Um,
Because the main systems are so hard to use and clunky
yeah,
that you can't even get home for dinner
right.
because you
And
can't get your
and
work done.
and I think it's in this zone where IT and cybersecurity can really clash the most, right?
Yeah.
Because IT wants people to be happy and to use the systems without making, support ticket requests every 10 seconds.
Yeah.
And it's and I think one of my colleagues put it so well in the not too distant past, which is that actually this may have been a client who said this, but IT and cybersecurity need to be able to disagree and talk things out.
Hmm.
And when they're collapsed, either because they're collapsed into the same people or they're collapsed into the same reporting structure, you lose that, right? And
You
that
do.
tension is a lot of what can actually produce best
Yeah.
outcomes.
Yeah. When it's really healthy, and I agree with that. And by the way, clients can be colleagues. I like to think of them as colleagues. But when it's really good, I call it like a creative tension, right? So good things come from it, and nobody takes it personally. And and it's healthy. When it's unhealthy, right, it devolves into disgust and contempt, and people can't work with each other, and it's awful. I've been in both situations. So I think that is a great example, Jake, of people on the outside looking in might see a cybersecurity person arguing with an IT person, and they might be scratching their head going, "What the heck are they arguing about?" Right? They're both on the same team, right? They're both just doing all the IT work that needs to be done. And that goes back to, my opening comment that yes, we often are on the same team. Yes, we do understand how all the systems work, but no, we don't have the same goals and we don't have the same ways of thinking, right? I'm always
Yeah.
thinking about what could go wrong. My IT friends are always thinking about, how great it's going to be when the system is up and running and is doing all these wonderful things that it was designed to do, happy path. And I'm over here, doing my little, my Chicken Little impression, trying to think of how the sky's going to fall, and what are we going to do to protect these digital assets? So there's absolutely a different way of looking at it.
So,
We just want people to have enough permissions to do their job and nothing more. And that takes a little extra effort, rather than just
oh, for
handing out
sure.
admin accounts to everybody.
Okay, so what action should a senior decision maker take if they have suddenly realized that their IT guy or gal isn't their cybersecurity guy or gal?
Right. Yeah. So now that's what that's my vision for senior decision makers, is that they will have this recognition. But many of them, as we've talked about, many of them don't. And it's a very difficult thing for them to come around to. But one thing that I definitely see them doing that is not helpful is they're looking for an easy button. It's like, oh, okay, well, we've got some cybersecurity problems. Let's just buy Norton antivirus, install it, and get on with our lives. Many of them
Oh,
are
those
stuck
were
in
the
that
days.
paradigm. It used to be the case that you could, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, even into the early 2000s, you could just buy a piece of software and install it and then walk
Yeah,
away
it,
from it, and
it
it would just
probably
sort of
even came in a
sit
box.
sit there and do it. It did, yeah, it absolutely did, and it was, it was very well graphically designed, and if it was Norton antivirus, it actually had a picture of Peter Norton on the cover with his little stethoscope around his neck, and it was very cool. But these days, that's a fantasy. There is no easy button that anybody can use these days. In reality, the only one I know of, in fact, is just don't use the internet. But that's not very practical, is it?
It is not.
No, it's totally impractical. So that's a problem that I see with senior decision makers, even when they admit that they have a lot of cyber risk, and particularly for the ones that haven't admitted that, is that they just think there's an easy button, and there isn't. And the ones that haven't admitted that they have a lot of cyber risk, man, they just kind of have this attitude that they're immortal and nothing bad will ever happen to them or their organizations. And when I talk to people like this, I very quickly get the feeling that I'm trying to sell life insurance to Zeus. And when I get that feeling, I just, I know that I can't do anything. There's nothing I can say. And it goes back to what you said a moment ago. If I could only put them in a ransomware simulator so they would know what it's like to lose control of all their equipment to a ransomware attack, that might help them turn the corner. But I can't do that. I don't know how to do that. So I just wish them well and I excuse myself from the conversation and I just get on with my day.
Okay, so what about the senior decision maker that does realize their IT guy or gal isn't their cybersecurity person? What should they do?
All right. So if you have this realization and you realize there's not an easy button, then this is going to sound familiar because I've said this before, but they should treat cyber as the general business risk that it's become, right? It's not just a tech thing. It's actually a major risk to their organization's success, just like risks in sales and order fulfillment and accounts receivable. If you can't sell, you're not in business. If you can't fulfill, you're not in business. If you can't collect money that people owe you, you're not in business. So
Not
that's
for very
that's
long, anyway.
yeah, not for very long, right? And so I know any senior decision maker who was having problems selling, fulfilling, or collecting money would be all over it because they would realize what an existential problem that is. And and I would say, that's where they have to get to with cyber. Now, let's assume that they accept that. Yes, it's a general business risk and I should treat it with that sense of gravity. Okay. Well, the next goal for them, the next thing I want them to think about is that they shouldn't be looking for perfect security, right? Don't say to me, make us like Fort Knox, right? Or make us as good as the NSA or anything like that, right? Because if there's anything Edward Snowden taught us, there's no such thing as perfect security or world-class security, because he worked for the NSA and look what he was able to do, right? He was an insider and he completely compromised the NSA. So it's not reasonable if the NSA with for all practical purposes infinite resources can't get world-class security going for themselves, we have no chance. The rest of us have no chance. So the goal is to make yourself a difficult target, right? So if you think about this product called the Club, I don't know if anybody remembers this, but it was a red bar. You put it on your steering wheel. I don't even know if you could buy these things anymore, but I used to see them everywhere.
I bet you can still buy them.
Probably you can, but I haven't seen one in a long time. But the idea, right, is you put this club on your steering wheel, and the idea was that if I stole your car, I wouldn't be able to drive it because this piece of steel was would keep me from turning the steering wheel in full revolutions. And so I would look through the window. I'm a car thief. I look through the window and I see this thing on your steering wheel, and I'm like, I'm not going to steal this car. What a pain in the ass. It'll take me forever. Like, I can defeat that club, but I can't stand here and try to defeat it in such an obvious way. I'm just going to move on to another car. And that's what I encourage customers to do. Just become a difficult target, right? Just make it a little bit more difficult to attack you than it is to attack somebody else. This is really the only practical response to what's going on in the world right now. We're all badly outgunned by the cyber criminals, and this I think is reasonable. So there you go.
Yeah,
That's what they should do.
I think that is reasonable as well, and I think we can we could dig into the how to do that, but I think we need to wrap up because we are running to almost 42 minutes here. So
Yeah, we really do need to wrap it up. For those of you who are sitting in your car because your commute has come to an end and you're like, come on, guys, shut up already. I got to get into work. That's what we're going to do right now. So that wraps up this episode of the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. And today we explored why your IT or gal isn't your cybersecurity person and what you can and should do about it. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
see you next time.
Thanks for joining us today on the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. If you need to overcome a cybersecurity hurdle that's keeping you from growing your business profitably, then please visit us at cr-map.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.